Hi everyone, this is audapostrophe. Let's continue our game of Raging Loop running on PlayStation 5.
私の知ってるヤス君は切羽詰まっても理屈っぽくそんなことを言う人だった。
知恵ね、言いたいことは分かったよ。僕はこいつが許せないんだ。え、あなたが適当なことを言って場をかき回すもんだから、匠兄も義継もモッチーも殺された。この後に及んで次は母さんだというあなたが許せないんだ。
ちょっと兄ちゃん、どうしたの？落ち着いて。
ああ、そうだね、優先度なんて忘れてた。僕はこいつの鼻を明かしたかった。それでハルちゃんを利用したのさ。知恵姉が言った通り、僕の本性はそれだけのつまらない人間だよ。これでも不満なの？知恵姉。
そうだね、らしくないとしか思わない。ヤス君、これはきっと疑心暗鬼だと思う。でも言うね、香織さんが食事を出した時、安永君とハルちゃんはいなかったよね。もし他の人があれで全滅してたら、残るは君たち2人だった。あとは春明さんか。もしあなたが狼だったらとても楽な展開だよね。
僕が母さんにあれをやらせたっていうのか、知恵ね。
そうだったら最悪だって思うよ。鳥兜を香織さんが取ったのはおそらく朝だよね。それ以外暇はなかったし、ずいぶん早起きだったし、その時からみんなを殺す気だった。夜の間に吹き込まれたとするなら話はわかるよね。
そんな。でも夜に連絡する手は。
狼は2人いる。
まさか
香織さんが唯一残った息子のために一人で汚れを被る覚悟で残る人の皆殺しを狙ったなら。
私も人だもん。
最後に狼と人が残っても投票にならない。ハルちゃんは何もできない。
嘘だよね、兄ちゃん。
ヤス君？
ありえないんだ。だって母さんが狼だったら義継が死ぬわけがない。あいつを生かすために僕を殺すならありえたかもしれないけど、僕が頼んだって聞いてくれるわけがないだろう。母さんは僕よりあいつの方が好きなんだから。
知恵ねえ、あんまりよ。兄ちゃんがお母さんにそんなこと言うはずないじゃん。
別に私はヨシ君が殺されたとは言ってない。彼は単に夜出歩いて汚れを受けただけかもしれない。それに香織さんは狼じゃなくても息子が狼だって知ったら汚れをいとわず助けるかもしれない。
そうやって都合のいいことを言って兄ちゃんをどんどん悪者にしようとしてるようにしか見えないわ。どうしちゃったのよ、知恵ね。私たちのことはどんな時だって守ってくれてたじゃん。あの人なの？夫妻師さんがそうやって言えって。あの人に出会って知恵姉は変わっちゃったの？
そんなことはないよ。ただあの人の真似をして自分の頭で考えてみただけ。一番信じたくないことだって、それが真実である可能性からは目を背けるべきじゃないって。
それで思いつきで僕に対して絶縁状と同じ一票を送ろうって言うんだね。
だってらしくないんだもん。そうやって脅しみたいなことを言うヤス君がさ、私からしたら君だよ。変わっちゃったように見えるのはさ。
で結局どうするのかね。投票先は。
言ったことには責任を持たなきゃね。私はヤス君を疑ったから、それをちゃんと形に残すよ。
では織部安永に1票だ。
順番がずれましたけど、席順で言えばタイバーが最初でしょ。タイバーどうする？
私は香織さんにするわよ。植松様は確かに狼とは思えん。
あなたはどうします？野里さん。
今さらあなたなどと。 私の答えは変わらんよ。それどころか今の芹沢の言葉で気持ちが固まった。織部安永、君が狼とは正直今の態度からは考えづらいが、母親がそうだという可能性は高そうだ。織部香織に1票。君はどうするのかね、織部安永。
変わらず植松里香子さんです。
私も植松里香子に投票するわ。
子供は放棄でいいか。
待って、メイコちゃん、よく考えて。あなたの票で人の勝ち負けが決まっちゃうかもしれないんだから。
知恵ねえ、そこまでするのか。小さい子にデタラメを吹き込んで票を奪おうなんて。
それしか手がないなら何だってする。メイコちゃん、リカ子さんがいなくなったら嫌だよね。嫌だったら。
無駄だよ。僕に投票させたって3人同率で決着がつかないだけだ。
いらない人選ぶの？
そうよ。
だったらおばちゃん怖かったから。
それは食堂の女の人かね。
うん。
決まりだな。
そんな冗談だろ。そんないい加減なことで母さんが。
それでも1票は1票だ。
兄ちゃん、終わった。
I heard muffled screams and sobs from the dining hall behind me. Gagged and tied, Kyoto Odabe was still waiting, or wailing. She couldn't move properly and had a pole fixed to her shoulders, but I was still worried enough to check every now and then. The lack of change helped calm my nerves, but at the same time, I resented myself a bit for it. Quite a bit of time had passed since the feast had begun. What kind of decision would they make? The daily wolf lynching, hanging, had failed every single time so far. Considering the number of days remaining and how many people were left, if they messed up today, the humans would lose all hope of surviving. If either Kyoto Odabe or Rikako Umatsu ended up choosing, there would just be no chance anymore. Once I saw people leaving the hall, my mouth moved on its own.
終わった。
Their eyes were steady. They walked in my direction. Not to me, though, but to the dining hall.
香織さんを選んだのか。
I asked anyway. I was speaking to the last representative of sanity in this place, Kinosuke Nasato.
どけ。
We didn't even converse. His tone and the look in his eyes were different from usual. His usual arrogant pride was gone, and in his place stood a deadly determination.
安永君。僕は負けました。春ちゃん。
私は嫌だって言った。
おばあさん。
新内様のおぼし飯じゃ。
ちえみ。
春明さんはこの子。
Meiko was at the rear of the group. Somewhat hesitantly, she walked up to me. I moved aside to let them pass. They all entered the dining hall and dragged out the victim. The ones holding the ropes and doing the dragging were Kinosuke Nasato and Chiemi Sedazawa. Following behind was Tai Yamawaki, prodding her onward with a bamboo broom.
やめろ。
As his mother cried out in pain, Yasunuga Odabe followed the group, hand in hand with Haru Makishima.
止めろ。
Haru Makishima was bawling. Yasunuga Odabe was shaking, but not even trying to hide his sobs. His face was warped in anguish.
誰か。
As the group faded away, the gag fell out, and the victim's voice grew loud. Not a scrap of reason remained, only raw terror. Or perhaps madness. Oh, please, someone. Beg for her life. However, I didn't hear any pleas to the very end, and I painfully realized I wasn't participating in the feast. I wasn't part of the life selection game bound by otherworldly rules.
見るな。
I turned Miko away, hugged her, and covered her ears. Because of that, I couldn't cover my own. Parent-like dedication. What a weird idea. Anyway, as the group disappeared into the mist, I somehow felt as though the screams, or laughs, grew even clearer. I was subjected to this illusion until the very end. During the final moments, the mother called out her son's name. It was the name of the elder son, and he responded by calling for his mother. But at the very last moment, it felt like the victim shouted out a different name. There was a strange sound, followed by silence.
Meko.
Miko's body was surprisingly warm. In response, she just nodded.
明日、僕と一緒にここを逃げよ
She nodded again.
う。植松里香子は諦めるんだ。
Miko started crying. I let her go, took her by the hand, and led her to the dorm. There, I took all the remaining food I had. Then I escorted her back to her place.
鍵をかけて、明日の朝、僕が迎えに来るまでじっとしてるんだ。
Still crying, she nodded.
これをちゃんと食べるんだぞ。
I gave her some food and closed the door. Once I turned around, I saw them.
今日の宴は終わった。
There wasn't a hint of emotion in his voice.
そうですか。
As one who didn't participate in the feast, I was in no position to criticize or support them. They just turned around and returned to their places, leaving no indicator whether they'd actually heard me. 3 of them were headed in the same direction. I didn't feel like joining them, instead casting a glare at their backs as they walked. My powerlessness was killing me. Under the assumption I would die tomorrow, I decided I would go through the mist down to Satanaga, a strict taboo here. What kind of death would that get me? Would I be injured? Wander in some other world? Something else entirely? Or perhaps I'd be eaten by a monster. I still had that incomprehensible memory, but it was enough to make me suspect that was the most likely scenario. Normally, people don't remember dying. The unknown was scary, but journeying into the unknown meant conquering that fear. So you could say there were some perks to remembering that death. But if I was guaranteed that I would die like that, I wasn't really keen on the idea. That had hurt like hell, not to mention how terrifying the experience was.
じゃあ、マシな死に方を考える。もっと痛くない死に方。あるいは、痛みと引き換えになるような何かを成し遂げる死に方。
Like if it led to the survival of a young child. Anyway, I'd wager my life. All that remained was finding supporters. I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths. I threw a Yakuza kick into the wall. Then I did a low kick with the other leg.
ついに尻尾中せて玉の扉数破れティアイ空虚の草むらに豚のムクロがシャウトする
As I sang the Buddha's ash rock, I attacked the wall with my ass, which prompted a response from the other side.
うるさい。
I heard Jamie's angry voice through the front door.
ちょっと声が笑ってるぞ。
あんなん誰だって反応に困るけど。
The walls were thin, apparently.
まあ、とりあえず明日逃げよっか。
どんな流れで何を言い出してるの。
それだけツッコミができるなら十分正気でしょう。脱出脱出。クレイジーゾーンからおさらばしようぜ。
あのね、春明さん。
僕は本気だ。
Still outside my door, she fell silent. It was only about 8, still a safe time. I walked up to the door and unlocked it.
ひどい顔。
そんなに？
嘘。
何その軽妙なふっかけ。彼氏か。
君の切り返しも本調子に見えるけど、でもそんな仮面の下に超常的苦悩を隠してんだろ。全部吐いちゃえよ。まあ、吐かなくてもいい。とりあえず座れば。
お邪魔します。
Alone in an empty room, we sat cross-legged and looked at each other.
今日の宴の内容を教えて。結局、誰なんだ？狼は。
もうわかんない。というかもう誰でもいい。
The situation was hopeless. She felt the same way. So far, there wasn't a single lynching with a good reason behind it, and it didn't feel like they'd gotten lucky and killed the wolf.
いっそあの青ビオタンが狼ならな。すっきり憎めるのに。
匠さんから お墨付きが出てる以上、その可能性はとても低い。
知ってる。
But still, assuming Yasunaga-kun was actually a wolf, I really doubted he was cold-hearted enough to keep up the act of a human while seeing off his mother to her death. Like Chimi had pointed out, it was best to assume Kaori-san had only done what she'd done for her son. If everyone died and only one was left, he'd be the victor regardless if he was human or a wolf. Probably. Whatever the case, it was important to note that it was wrong to guess whether Yasunaga-kun was a wolf based on this alone. Kiori Orabe was in a messed up mental state that led her to plot the deaths of herself and everyone else just to save her son. It was simply an immense power of motherly love at work. I'd messed up by sending Hara-chan to the second floor. Kiori-san probably resented me for that. Not to mention, I was the one who'd pinned her down. Being the target of a dead person's enmity was a rare experience, and in my opinion, it was uncomfortable.
やっぱ私には無理だったな、春明さんの真似は。
僕の真似？
うん。考えていろいろやってみたけど。
Was I a bad influence on her? Well, carefully deliberating your actions was never a bad thing, obviously. Also, it was worth noting that she pointed out that Yasunaga-kun tried to guilt trip her wasn't like him. Her own intuition was important too. Besides him, there was Tai-san, who believed nothing but the superstitious, Haru-chan, who always agreed with Yasunaga-kun, and Meiko, the one who sealed Kaori's fate.
みんな怪しいな。
だからもう誰でもいい。
Jamie hung her head.
メイコちゃんは助けてやることに決めてるんだけど。
どうやって？ここを出て？無理だって言ってんじゃん。
待ってて確実に死ぬよか良くないか？彼女が狼だったら一人減らせてラッキーかもよ。
なのかな。もうわかんない。人殺しちゃった。
She actually said it casually, but I could tell that it was hard for her to say.
君は悪くないさ。
I responded casually. I felt like breaking the illusion would be too much to handle.
軽っ。
そもそも君は反対したろ？
一応殺人を止めなかったってことはそれに賛同したってことじゃない？
それは僕も同じだし。
ああ、そっか。
それに異常な状況下で異常な決断をしてしまうことに法はある程度理解を示すんじゃないかな。
法ねえ。
どうにしたってまともな法で裁かれるなら意味不明な山の掟に裁かれるより億倍マシでしょう。それともちえみちゃんはむしろ超常的な死を遂げたいのか？どれも的を外してるってところか。
Man, this was complicated.
神様ってやつのせいか。
半分はそう。
もう半分は説明しづらい。
うん。
じゃあ神様の方を話してよ。
どう言えばいいのかな。神様は不幸なんだ。
ん？
いや、辞書的な意味で不幸のことをそう呼んでるわけじゃなくて、そのね、神様がいるからどうやっても私たちは幸せになれない。
それは目に見えるもの？
うん。私たちはみんな見てる。でも本質は目に見えないものかも。
目に見える部分について聞こう。それは人間？
Though slowly and hesitantly, she gave me a light nod.
それはYasumizuの誰か？
Silence, neither yes nor no.
じゃあ上藤吉の人間？
She kept her silence. Her shoulders were shaking a bit.
じゃあ
違う、やっぱ違う。人間じゃない。人間をどうしたって神様はどうにもならない。
Shit, I knew it'd go like this.
落ち着いて説明するんだ。じゃないと僕も君もやられる。
いっそ殺してくれればいい。こんなひどい夢とっとと終わらせてほしいのに。ねえ春明さん、私を殺して。あなたの手なら私死ねる気がする。
何言い出すんだ。しっかりしろ。
私しっかりしてる。私は汚れてなんかない。私は狂ってない。狂ってなんか。おかしいのは藤吉全部よ。お かしいのは神様の方よ。
神様とは状態のことなのか？
I just kind of blurted out something without thinking. Jamie was clearly in a state of panic. The despair was one cause, but someone panicked like this couldn't explain themselves properly. Also, I didn't feel like this was simply some spiritual being she could see. She could perceive God as a sensation of sorts, and the fact others couldn't caused her to panic. Explaining a sense like that wasn't easy, and trying to explain it in detail was also a reminder of how much it scared her. I had to try and understand what she was sensing, and find a better word for it other than God. That's what I thought to myself after saying those words, but why did she suddenly go quiet? She was raising her head, and her eyes were wide, staring right at me. She'd completely stopped voicing her pain. Did I hit the nail on the head? I considered that possibility. I felt a cold, damp breeze from behind me. She wasn't staring at me. She was staring at something behind me. I turned around, followed the direction of her eyes. How long had the front door been open? Had I forgotten to lock the door? And how long had that thing been there? There was a person outside. Was it even human? Through the darkness, I could see that it definitely had a humanoid silhouette. But it was definitely abnormal. Its body was covered in bandages. No sutras? It was a smallish boy, or girl, covered in marked cloth. Again, was it even human? I asked the same question again, unable to even voice the words. I couldn't move a finger, or rather I didn't, because I had no idea what would have happened if I did. As the tension began to overwhelm me, I saw its lips move.
黄泉の匂いに狼は来ある。みそぎ物意味夢見せよ。不死吉の娘。
A howl. I heard something fall. Turning back, I realized it was Jamie.
ちえみ
Still confused, I rushed over and caught her. It was a momentary loss of consciousness. She hadn't fainted. She just seemed to be drifting at the border of reality.
おい、しっかりしろ。
私なんでこの部屋どこ？
さっきのやつは何なんだ？
さっきのおかしいな。なんだろう。眠い。ごめん。帰るわ。
Jamie stood up. Her eyes were utterly devoid of life. She headed to the door. It was closed. There was no one there. I set that matter aside for now. Jamie was way more important. I had to stop her. That was why I
絶対に連れて行く。
wrapped my arms around her.
捨てる命なら僕にくれ。明日の朝、ちえみとメイコを連れてここを出る。
君を連れてじゃないんだ。
That was her first response in a while.
君によろしくお願いされたからね。その意は最後まで組ませてもらう。
律儀なんだ。
でしょ。実は子供を見殺しにするのは他よりも気分が悪いって打算もあったりするんだ。
悪ぶれてないよ、春秋さん。あといつの間にか呼び捨てになって。
嫌だった？
嫌じゃないけど、けじめというか区切りは欲しいな。
僕と付き合って。
いいよ。
だから一緒に逃げよ
分かった。言っておくけど、一緒に死んでもいいって意味だから。メイコちゃんのことは悪いけどあんま考えてないし。
自分に責任持てよ。
ちえみさんどうも脳に問題があるっぽいから、年長者に頼っちゃいたい。
任せろ。あと他に希望者がいたら連れて行くから。
私は特別扱いじゃないんだ。
特別扱いだよ。他は任意だけど、君とは付き合った以上踏んじばってでも連れて行く。
微妙。
知ってるか？僕はモテないんだ。
春秋さん、ありがとう。
Her teary voice compelled me to embrace her.
私が今夜狼に殺されたら。
言うな。
私の何でもいいから、どこか一部だけでも外に連れてって。
心配するな。
怖いよ。
僕がいる。僕がいるから。
It hurt to say baseless things. Even so, I kept on saying whatever I could to make her feel better. This went on for only 10 minutes or so, though. Even if the wolves didn't pay us a visit, we'd have to respect the rules of living here. We awkwardly exchanged some parting words, and I saw her off as she returned to her room, her parting ways with a frail smile on her damp face. Tomorrow. Everything would be decided tomorrow. 5:16, Friday. Another morning. Aside from being really hungry, I woke up the same as always. I hadn't died. The only real difference this morning was that I could go outside as I pleased. It was still misty out and I couldn't see much beyond the dorm. A settlement isolated in mist, a space cut away from the world. Could we really leave this place? We could. It had to be physically possible. The idea that we couldn't was just speculation, no matter how much this place defied reality. What was that thing? Why had Jamie collapsed? How sane were we? Was this even really happening? Human senses and memories often lied to us, though just dismissing anything that didn't make sense as an illusion wasn't a good idea. That thing had actually visited us. Its appearance was strange, but I had little proof that it was something supernatural. Thus, that had to be human. As for the reason Jamie collapsed, there were quite a few possibilities, unless it was a trick she'd schemed with that thing beforehand. That being had to have been too much for her to handle emotionally.
あいつ、なんて言ってたっけ?
The wolves cometh to the smell of Yomi, cleanse, shelter, and dream, daughter of Fujiyoshi, was it? It basically seemed like a fancy way of saying, get back to your room and sleep. So it was a warning from those who made the rules. Then was that something on the mountain? Great Lord Shinai's side? No, to be honest. I'd say it was more like something from the other side. I mean, it kind of fit my image of Yomibito. It wore sutras in place of clothing, and the cloth over its face reminded me of a funeral shroud. The word corruption seemed particularly fitting. It had a really sinister aura, to me anyway. Though that was strange. Great Lord Shinai was the enemy of the forces of Yomi. Yomibito wouldn't act as his messengers. This contradiction. It was quite eerie, an alluring unknown. But that didn't matter now. My goal was to let Jamie and any supporters we gathered escape. I returned to the room, made my futon, and started searching again. The futon was the only thing in the closet. There was nothing I could use as a weapon. I gave up and left the room, and went to Jamie's. If worse had come to pass, I had to fulfill her last request. The door was locked.
やはり、そうか。
So the wolf was... I knocked. She came out after just a few seconds. Apparently she was already ready to go.
武器が欲しい。
そう思って。
She gave me a pretty large knife with a sheath, probably used for hunting.
君のは？
前の包丁はなくしちゃったから、それきり。だから守ってね。
任せて。
I had zero confidence in pulling it off, but sometimes bravado was important to hold on to. We went to Hara-chan's room. It wasn't locked. The room was no bigger than the others, but it was a huge mess. But it didn't look like there was a corpse present. She either already woke up and went outside without locking the door, or her corpse was somewhere outside, like Yoshitsu-kun. I'd gained a habit of expecting the worst.
安永君は？
同じ。
メイコのところへ行こう。
Today's mist was denser than usual. Just extending my arm was enough to make my hand hazy and indistinct. I kept on walking, knife in my right hand and Jamie's hand in my left. The settlement was way too quiet. We headed for the village plaza. I almost tripped a few times on the field paths, but Jamie held me on my feet. With just a few warnings, I could keep going as long as she was with me. We arrived at the plaza. There was no one there. Basically, there was no need to use the dining hall as the go-to gathering spot anymore. We passed Rikako Umetsu's house. It didn't look unlocked, but I couldn't hear any indications of movement from inside. Was she asleep? Or did something happen to her? Whatever the case, I had no choice but to ignore her.
ここだっけ?
Miyako's place was... open? Thankfully, all I found inside was just a messy futon. It was the same as Hara-chan's room. But now that it happened with 3 people, it was safe to assume something wasn't right.
ちえみ、悪いけどこれ、返す。
I gave her the knife. I grabbed a stick lying against the house.
どういうこと？
実際に使える武器がいるから。それより、どこを目指そう？
やっぱり、お堂かな。
As it turned out, that was exactly where the other inhabitants were. With the exception of one, anyway.
遅かったね。いや、私らが早すぎたか。
Hara Makishima, she was in her usual agitated state. Tai Yamawaki, she was silently chanting something to herself. Meiko, Hara-chan, had her hands on her shoulders, but she still looked anxious. And finally...
おはよう、ちえね。それに、久石春明さん。
Yasunaga Odabe, his face was grim. Those were all the people here, meaning that...
ついに、野里さんか。
A simple process of elimination was good enough to know he was gone. Anyway, it was time for the first battle.
メイコ、おいで。
She tried to walk to us. But Haru Makishima stopped her. It was time. I raised my stick and...
本性を表しましたが、久石さん。
Yasunaga Odabe stood in my way. He had a menacing looking grass sickle in his right hand. He readied it for a swing at me.
あなたが全ての不幸の根源だ。最後だと思って今朝、実力に訴えるのは予想してましたよ。
嘘。何？
知恵ねえは騙されてたんだ。この人が汚れの元凶だよ。この人を宴に混ぜないのは失敗なんだ。この人をくくってれば、母さんも義継もみんな死ななくてよかった。
待って、そんな。
今日はこの人をくくるんだ。そうすれば全部終わるから。
安永くん、よくないな。誰も知らないストーリーを軸に大事な話を進めたら。
それはあなたもでしょ。どうして急に殴りかかろうとしたの？
おお、そりゃそうだ。ちなみに行動理由は人質奪還ね。
だからそれは。
まあその前に、ここで混乱の極みを味わっているちえみちゃんにフォローをしておく許可をくれよ。
They didn't say another word. Chiemi and Meiko were the only ones who seemed confused at all. Basically, the others had prepared for this.
誰が狼かはさておいて、まず大事なことは2つ。まず、昨日僕はメイコに対してこの集落を脱出することを持ちかけた。それは昨日皆に聞かれたと考えるべき。村からの脱走は禁忌、それは知ってる。問題は村からの脱走をみすみす見逃す側も汚れの対象になるかどうかって点だから、早朝にメイコの身柄を抑えた。これはまあ話としてわかる。もう一つ、昨日ちえみと安永くんは対立関係になった。そのままならば今日の宴では両者の一騎打ちだ。基本的にははるちゃんの票をほぼ確定票で抑えている安永くんが有利だろう。しかしタエさんとメイコという不動票がある以上確定じゃない。だからちえみと和解して唯一の部外者である僕を狙うのが一番安全確実だと踏んだんだよね。違わない。だから僕を黙らせるためにメイコを人質に取っている。
違う。あなたがこの子を人質に取って僕らにひどい要求をすると思ったから。
僕にそんなことをして何の得がある？ぶっちゃけ僕は宴には関わってない。君だって納得してたはずだ。
それが間違いだったんですよ。じゃあこの場の他の誰が元凶だって言うんですか？僕もはるちゃんも家族を失った。タエバーだって匠さんを失った。僕らはみんな大事な誰かを失ってる。じゃあ失ってないのはあなただけだ。久石春明さん、
Oh, so that was his story, huh? Sorry, Yasunuga-kun, but you're a bad storyteller.
君は嘘とか無茶を言うときに雄弁になる癖があるみたいだね。
ふざけるのは大概にしてください。
さすがに今はおふざけは自重してるよ、安永くん。君は人を感情で動かそうとしすぎている。そして千恵美のことも舐めている。君の言動のおかしなところを感情論で押し切れると思っている。確かに全ての悪事を僕のせいにすれば感情的には収まりがつくだろう。しかし一方で君は自分のキャラを大事にしなさすぎだ。冷静沈着、年上の暴論にも理屈でこうするキャラをね。
勝手な分析やめてください。
まあそれは10年だか何年だか君を見てきた村の方々が決めることだ。僕や君が決めるものじゃない。もちろん君だって心境の変化があってもおかしくないほど辛い体験をしたっていうのはわかる。じゃあ聞いてみようよ。君が完全に理性を失って僕というよそ者に怒りを向けているのか、あるいはとても冷静に僕をくくって今日の宴を空振りさせ自分の有利にことを運ぼうとしてるのか。つまり昼の死刑を回避して得をする陣営の人間なのか。どっちだと思う、千恵美。
She gasped and looked at Yasunuga Orobe. There was suspicion in her eyes, not trust.
言えばよかったんだ、僕のことを狼だと。それでも言わなかった。あくまで元凶と言い続けた。自分が狼だと知っているから。嘘をつくのが苦手なんだろう。かといって勝負どころじゃつかなきゃならない嘘はつかなきゃダメなんだよ。
知恵ねえ、こんな奴のことを信じるの？
そうやって理屈に対して感情論しか準備してないのは君の甘いところだ。君は最後まで理屈で戦うべきだった。
うざい。あんたに何がわかる。ヘラヘラしてるだけで何もしなかった、できなかったくせに。
He had a point there. I did feel like shit about that. I should have joined the feast from the get-go. If I had, I wouldn't have wasted time on pointless arguments and autopsies. However,
僕はな、自分で考える頭を持ってたくせに早々に迷信におもねって弟と母親を見殺しにした君に対して一人の大人として率直に怒ってるんだぜ、安永くん。
once I said that, Yasunuga Orobe hung his head and fell silent. 10 seconds of silence were enough for everyone to realize he'd lost the argument. However, the expression on his face was abnormally calm.
確かに僕は狼ですが、
He spoke as if it wasn't a big deal,
あなたはいくつか勘違いをしてる。
but that just made it seem even more abnormal.
もう僕らは勝ってるんですよ。
He tossed away the grass sickle. His voice wasn't nearly as passionate as before. It was cold and rational. He demonstrated a confidence rooted in sound logic, but I couldn't understand what he meant.
もう一人の狼出てきてください。
What was the point of that?
いいね、ヤス君。
ええ、もういいです。
あたしがもう一人の狼よ。
I couldn't make sense of this. Had he decided to graciously concede by selling out his partner that now that he'd been cornered? No, he said he'd already won. Even if there were 2 wolves, there were 4 of us. They'd lose in votes. My answer came from a completely unexpected direction.
兄ちゃん、
兄ちゃん、やっぱりタイバーと兄ちゃんが狼様だったんだね。
A shout of pure, unadulterated joy. Hara Makishima became the least comprehensible of anyone present. She ran to Yasunuga Orobe and hugged him. He hesitated for a moment, but reciprocated. Meiko, still as clueless as ever, slowly walked over to us.
お姉ちゃん。
ごめんな、お姉ちゃんに隠れときな。
ルアキさん、これって一体。
わからん。
I really didn't. But I had a feeling that something wasn't quite right for a while now, and I suspected it'd be made clear now. I was certain of it, and it left me feeling uneasy.
OK。主導権は君に移った。説明を聞かせてもらえるかな。
タエバー、お願い。
もうずっとヤス君には頼りっぱなしだったからね。
So, she wasn't even denying it.
ちいちゃん、メイコちゃん。
Not me?
これは話しちゃおらんかったけどね。昔、ずーっと昔に、あたしが娘だった頃に、上藤吉の門が山祭りで酔って言うとったのよ。読み意味の宴についての本当のお話をね。
The truth? Tai Yamawaki told us a story that was very similar to the legend they told in this strange village. Well, it was less like it was similar, and more like I was looking at it from the opposite angle. The part about Great Lord Shinai sending the 5 guardians to help people was the same. 4 of them teamed up with the humans to murder the wolves. However, in the real story, the good and bad sides were completely reversed. Apparently, the people and the 4 guardians joined Yomi on the very first feast of the Yomi Purge. Basically, all of them were Yomibito. They all ganged up on, overpowered, and exposed the wolves, who tried to resist until the very end. That meant this land had belonged to the Yomibito for a long, long time. The wolves were summoned here by none other than Shinai-sama himself. Some people of Yasumizu were given the blessing of the wolves and had to free Yasumizu of its Yomibito. Basically, it was a holy war for them. And that was the truth behind the feast of the Yomi Purge. Tai Yamawaki continued her explanation.
そんなもんは上藤吉の方々が私たちをバカにしてから考えたもんじゃと思ったのよね。だけどそうじゃない。本当じゃと親鸞様は加護をくださるとともにそう言われなさった。じゃからね、ちいちゃん、あたしらはみんな亡きにしてやらねばならんかったのよ。つらかったけどもね。匠も苦しそうにしとったけれど、でもこうしてやらねば読み人は救われんと親鸞様は言われるのよ。
Tai Yamawaki was crying. All right. So she was now a confirmed culprit who believed the murders to be salvation. There were just 2 more points I didn't understand. The corruption. And the eerie message. Most things made sense if you switched Shinai-sama's enemies and allies. The idea that people wearing those outfits could be the good guys was kind of weird, but, well, that was the culture here. Or maybe only the Yomibito, me too, saw them as evil. Maybe that was the story here. The problem here was that Jamie didn't know this.
僕は加護を受けた時に知った。
So even Yasunuga-kun didn't know about it. I remembered some of his words.
学校の先生の受け売りですけど、思想を与えればいいんじゃないですか。要は自分たちのしていることが正しいと思えればいいんじゃないかって。
He really hated lies, didn't he? He basically told me the truth of things. This feast actually had a system that made zealous murderers of people. Whatever. Oh, whatever. Enough about Yasunuga Orabe.
なぜハルちゃんは知ってた？
She was glad when she realized Yasunuga Orabe was a wolf. Basically, she already knew the real story, that the wolves were the good guys. Why? Who told her?
狼様が私に教えてくれた。おじいちゃんが死んだ日に私の夢に出てそう教えてくれたんだ。
Nonsense. Insanity. Did she seriously decide to throw her life away over a dream? But on the day Oji-chan died, he died the night before Hara-chan tried to run away from the settlement. She believed the dream. She started to despair over being surrounded by Yomibito and planned to escape. That made sense.
でもタエバーはきっと正しい言い伝えを知ってると思った。 タイバーが知らないはずないって。なのに言い出さないから、もしかしたらって思ってたし、兄ちゃんは二人で話した時、もしかしたらって思って。
It all clicked. She believed. She believed the sudden revelation despite a lack of proof, and that the man she liked was in the minority that had justice on their side. And right now she said she would betray the humans and join the wolves. She believed Yasumizu Odabe was right with all of her heart. And so, the wolf, Yasumizu Odabe, had 3 votes for the feast.
知恵姉とメイコが僕に投票しても僕を殺すことはできない。ルールを曲げて不採さんを宴に呼んでも3票だ。決選投票をしても1人に選ぶことはできない。かくして2人とも欠けることなく狼の勝ちです。楽勝でしたね。
I saw it clearly now. I understood.
春明さん、それって。
そうだね。安永君の言う通りだ。ちえみたちの、いや、僕たちの負けだ。
Everyone had different reactions to my words. Jamie backed away and gasped. Tai Yamawaki closed her eyes and sighed. Mieko didn't seem to understand anything. Yasunuga Odabe didn't react at all. Haru Makishima was smiling. Oh man. All I really had left was struggling like the filthy, annoying adult I was.
はるちゃん。
何よ。あ、兄ちゃん。この不採さんはどうなるの？
このまま何も関わらないのならば僕は無視する。
そう。
Was that relief just now? Sorry, but I couldn't enjoy my sudden jump in popularity.
なきにせいでもええのかね。
必要なら神内様がどうにかするさ。でも黙ってはいないのでしょ、あなたは。
See, that dispassionate tone didn't do much to convince me he truly believed this ridiculous superstition.
さあね。正直、そっちが善玉なら、読み人側に手を貸すのも微妙って気はしてきたし。
春明さん？
思ったより薄情なんですね。
都会人の合理性とでも思ってくれれば？
見損なったとは言いませんよ。正しい判断です。とても正しい。
Big words.
ちょっと、そんなのないでしょ。あなたあれだけ知恵姉のことが好きとか言っておいて見捨てるの？
Good point. Well, yeah, I was pretty damn cold-blooded.
痛いところを突かれるばかりでも不愉快だから反論しちゃおうかな。はるちゃんよ。
何よ。
わかってると思うけど、君は死ぬぜ。それでいいんだよな。
This was pretty damn bad, honestly. Apparently, the Great Lord Shinai was a huge scumbag. He should have told her that much.
君に聖典を教えたところで、君が人側であることに変わりはない。君は狼になったわけではないだろう。匠さんや野里さんを殺したわけではないだろう。
殺してないけど。
なぜだか知らないが、君は聖典を知ってしまっただけのただの人だ。だから人が負けるということは、君も死ぬということだ。二人きりの時の話で、安永君が狼である可能性に思い当たったと言っていたね。安永君がミスでそんなことをするとは思えないから、きっと君の挙動不審から、君がそういう役回りだと感づいて、それで自分の正体を確定させないままに誘導して、君が誘いに乗るかどうかを試したんじゃないかと思うわけだけど、狼はそういう役回りの人がいることを知っていたということじゃないのかな。
それがどうした？
He actually said that? This was the part where he was supposed to start lying. But not denying that, you basically admitted that you were an absolute scumbag who used Haru-chan knowing that you'd have to kill her. He was doing bad. He was that bad at lying? Then how did he survive so long? Wait, something was very wrong. I'd seriously misunderstood something here. And soon enough, my hunch was proven right.
本当それが何だってのかしらね。
Hara-chan. Makshima's voice was brimming with joy, a carefree smile, laced with seductive intoxication.
読み人はくくられなきゃならない。汚れた醜いおぞましい私たちには狼様の渦と爪だけが救いなの。誰だってわかるわ、そんなこと。だから兄ちゃんは香織さんを手にかけたんだもんね。お母さんを幸せにするために。
ああ、
その通り。
兄ちゃん、春も幸せにして。
Hara Makshima coitiously leaned on him. Yasunaga Orobe brought her closer without even a flicker of emotion crossing his face. Tai Yamawaki watched them with a broad smile. What? What the hell? What were these people?
それで知恵ね、どうする？おとなしくするなら救ってあげる。
I underestimated it. I underestimated the madness of Yasumizu, and I realized too late that the Feast of the Yomi Purge wasn't just a system where zealous murderers killed each other. There was something here that completely shattered the people on a fundamental level. It was like a gear of madness. Those who knew the real story found salvation in death. That insane tale instantly convinced people that it was right to agree and to find peace in that. And I was actually surrounded by those very people. Understanding that made me remember that she was from here too. Jamie was trying to take a step forward. I should have realized this earlier. She, who was afraid of God, was just like them, who accepted their salvation. Both brands of madness probably had roots in the exact same thing, so she was just as susceptible to madness as they were. However, it wasn't too late for her. Yasunuga Orobe's expression stayed the same. But right before I looked away from him, I saw a slight change. It was bitterness, irritation, something out of place on a victor's face. That made me realize that his plan for this scene wasn't lost to madness, that I had no choice but to take advantage of the opportunity. I grabbed Jamie's hand. I pulled with so much force that she fell on her backside, but I didn't care. I dashed past her, and I swung my weapon at Yasunuga Orobe. I hit Hara Makishima once, Tai Yamawaki twice, and Yasunaga Orobe 5 or 6 times. Then I ran to Chiemi and Meiko, who were completely dumbfounded and fled the hall. There was no time to waste. I had to hurry and escape. If I didn't, I'd waste the one chance he'd given me.
なあ、ちえみ。
何？
あの安永君ってのは本当に頭が良くてやがるな。
何のこと？
お手って痛い。転んじゃう。
I was probably irritated, and not just because of the hunger. It was because of the epiphany I'd had, and because it had taken me so long to reach it. Yasunaga Orobe had a different motive.
芹沢ちえみに惚れている君は彼女だけは手にかけたくなかった。そして残っていた合理的思考でわずかでも彼女を救う可能性があるのは脱出しかないと判断した。しかし大っぴらに脱出を認めれば他の全員に汚れが及ぶがゆえに、僕が全員を叩きのめして無理やり連れて行ったという形を取らざるを得なかったということなのだろう。くそ。
If he didn't intend me to let me run away, he wouldn't have thrown away the sickle. He was basically signaling me to understand and finally attack him. In the end, he was far more clever than me. I never stopped dancing to his tune. Exactly because of that, I had to help these two escape no matter what.
なんせ大人だからな。
By the way, using an adult without relying on one yourself was a very adult thing to do, Yasunuga Orobe. Good luck with the rest. We crossed the field paths. We went past the stone graves, and over the boundary. Descending the cliff took a lot of patience. It didn't seem like they were chasing us, so we could go down carefully. Chiemi's expression was dead. She'd been hit hard by a sudden revelation. The game board had been flipped flipped on her and she'd lost, and now she had to suddenly say goodbye to her old friends. It was hard to just laugh that off. Should I have told her about Yasunuga-kun's attentions? I did consider it, but couldn't bring myself to. He chose to save her by sacrificing their relationship. If she knew, she'd probably want to go back to the settlement. Or maybe I just didn't want to say it because of my pride as a man. That was fine by me, too. Being able to shrug off such unfairness was one of the blessings of adulthood. So I consoled Chamie, who shouted to Meiko to be more careful, and generally talked as much as I could. The mist grew even denser.
ねえチーミもう村の外って言ってよくない？
そうかもね。
やったぞ。ほら何事もなく抜けられた。
やった
そうそう。さあ川を下って町に戻ろう。
川どっち？
I couldn't see anything. I hadn't just lost my bearings. It was worse than that. I couldn't even see Chamie or Meiko's face, and I was actually holding their hands. We were already at the bottom of the cliff, walking on the stones below. We heard water, so it was clear we were close to the river, but I didn't know if we could keep going right now.
ちょっと休もうか。
無理よ。
チーミ
I thought she was going to freak out again, but
違うの。
she stopped me.
聞こえないかな。水音以外に何か。
Confused, I strained my ears.
何か聞こえる？
ワンワン
追ってきてる。
They were acting strange. I strained my ears again. Was it above us? I could hear the faint sound of rustling leaves from the top of the cliff.
逃げなきゃ。
もう疲れた。
春明さん、メイコちゃんを。
The intensity in Chamie's voice made me take the situation seriously. What if the sound was just the wind, though? Was she jumping at shadows? But I would be lying if I said I wasn't worried. After all questions remained unanswered, and according to the legend, this was their HQ. Wait, they were the good guys, right? Still, this wasn't a normal place. I had to get out of here ASAP. After a while, I was forced to recognize the anomaly. We couldn't reach the river. I ran along the riverbed. It should have been small, just a few meters wide, but even after 10 minutes of running, there was no sight of the river. We couldn't get anywhere. It was just like Ringwanderung, a phenomenon where people wandering snowy peaks lose their sense of direction and just end up walking in circles. However, even if my sight was limited, how could anyone get lost on such a small riverbed? I could hear the stream right next to me. This felt so wrong. I was as good as blind. All I could trust were my ears, but that just made me realize how useless that was to rely on. I trusted my senses of directions less with each passing second. So, the sound of parting grass in the distance, the sound of claws stepping on the rocks. I felt like they were getting closer. I couldn't be certain. Eventually, we slowed down. The others didn't say anything, but they were clearly exhausted. We hadn't eaten for days, not to mention the dense mist made our clothes all uncomfortably damp and cold. We walked along the riverbed without uttering a single word. The sound of water wasn't getting any closer, but something else sure was. Something. Things I didn't know scared me. The chill and the fear strangled me like a garrote, and as I carried Meiko, passed out from exhaustion on my back. How long has it been like this? Suddenly, the hand I was dragging became heavier. Chamie had stopped.
春明さん。
何かな？
She called my name through the mist. I tried to sound lighthearted, but I wasn't confident I pulled it off.
もうダメだ。これ。
Her voice suggested the image of a grim smile.
何を言ってんだ？
Unlike before, I couldn't imagine the defiant tone I'd used whenever she said something stupid. It was true that something unnatural was happening and that there was no simple explanation. And Chamie was wearing down both physically and emotionally.
ちょっと休もう。それで進めばすぐ抜けられる。大丈夫だ。
ダメだよ。無理だよ。
どうして？
あのね、私がいたらきっと川は越えられないんだ。
What? That was like...
だって言ってたじゃん。読み人は私たちの方だって。だから
彼岸を渡れないとでも言うつもりか。
だって私 小さい頃からずっと安水のものを食べてきた。それに私は汚れてるから。
ちえみ。
見ないで。
I turned around and pulled her by the arm. I looked at her face from point-blank range. It was covered in brown and yellow blisters. Before I could even be surprised or disgusted, I just kissed her. The sugary taste of blood, pus, and rust filled my mouth and spread through my throat. I didn't care. Then to discard all unnecessary emotions, I hugged her as hard as I could. My breathing and thoughts ceased. I kept it up until the pain began to fade, then disappeared completely. Eventually, our lips were separated again. She prioritized words over breaths.
ごめんなさい。ごめんなさい。ごめんなさい。本当。ごめん。
Even so, I hugged her tight. I couldn't lose to something so ridiculous. She weakly hugged me back, but she couldn't keep it up for long.
行こう。
だから。
行こう。
The presence in the distance was definitely closing in. We walked. I felt like I'd been walking for several hours now. Our pursuers were close now, but I had no intention of rushing. Jamie was slowly but surely getting weaker by the second. Her speech slackened with each step, and the weight on my arms was becoming heavier. I could hear her cough and vomit something out. She apologized every time she did, and I basically replied with, "It's all right," using different words every time. We walked. Jamie's feet began to make wet sounds with every step. We walked. Maybe we'd actually been here for only a few minutes? We walked. Jamie kept apologizing. Maybe we haven't even moved a single meter. We walked. Maybe none of it was real. Then, maybe nothing that happened here would be weird. Eventually, Jamie called out to me with a hoarse voice.
春秋さん。
The fact that she said something different had sparked a moment of baseless hope, and so
ありがと
her gratitude was followed by another wet sound.
う。楽しかった。
But with those final words, her weight vanished. It was strange. After all, I was still holding her hand. Or rather, only her hand. With a splash, her bodily fluids spread out, while her limbs and entrails just collapsed. Jamie was gone, leaving behind only her rotting hand. Perhaps her remains were piling up in the mist ahead. I had a strange uncertainty that I couldn't touch it ever again. Was this what they called a Yomobito? I couldn't accept this, no matter what.
私の何でもいいからどこか一部だけでも外に連れてって。
I put the hand in my jacket pocket. I took Meiko, still sleeping, and shifted my grip to make carrying her easier. I continued walking, far too long. Meiko woke up. She was shocked that Jamie was gone and cried for a bit, but then she wanted to walk by herself, so I put her down on the ground. At the very next moment, she was dragged into the mist. It was clearly a malicious force that did that. To me, it looked like a furry arm. A scream resounded. It was an inhuman animalistic scream. After hesitating for a moment, I turned to run and caught a glimpse of something beastly with the mist Meiko had disappeared into. I ran. And ran. Suddenly, I felt myself step into something wet. I had arrived at the river. It was meaningless. I'd lost everything. And in the end, only I survived.
私の何でもいいからどこか一部だけでも外に連れてって。
Was there any meaning in fulfilling that promise? No. The meaning was for me to find. That was why I had survived and find a forest. Yeah. I still had that hope back then. They finally broke through the mist and showed themselves. Oh, of course. This really was hell, wasn't it? This wasn't the human realm or nirvana. It was a river of hell, so of course both sides were going to be hell. There was no splash when we threw Takumi-san's body in, was there? The moment we went into the mist and down the cliff, our bodies vanished from the world and reached a plane from which there was no return. And I finally had no choice but to accept it. As someone who had taken in the flesh and blood of a Yomibito, Chaimi, I couldn't escape either. That's why I screamed stupidly, only managed to run a few steps before their sinister claws tore me apart. Damn it. Where had I gone wrong? Descending into Satanaga? Not believing Chaimi when she told me we couldn't escape? No, it went back even earlier than that. I already knew the answer. Oh, shit. I really wished I'd been part of Yasumizu and participated in the Feast of the Yomi Purge. Maybe I could have gotten a different ending than this. That was the last thought that went through my head before all faded away. Alright, so hopefully 2 episodes ago you would have figured out who the guilty parties were. But of course, Haru was a bit of a wild card, right? We didn't know that she would be willing to help the wolves, or that there would be a participant in the story that was willing to help the wolves. So that's that's something that we'd have to know going into the next loop. Bearing in mind that if there's 2 wolves, you actually have 3 opponents to worry about. Again, I think this is all really incredibly well done, and we're nowhere near done. There is a lot more to this visual novel, and the number of different paths that you take, and the number of different deaths, and the number of different combinations of characters you play, or roles inside of the game that you play. It gets really, really interesting. And the best part is it has an absolutely bonkers ending, which is completely satisfying. Alright, now we have Key 4, Sink into Nirvana. Ending number 1. Yeah, let's watch the hint corner.
よう大将、まずはお疲れさんだな。最初のメインルート、読みはこれで終了だ。達成感とラブラブな空気に存分に浸るがいいぜ。無理かよ。せっかくテンション上げてやったのによ。まあ無理もねえか。とんでもねえ鬱な結末だったもんな。が、気合い入れてくれ。より良い結末をお望みなら力になるぜ。今回のバッドじゃないエンド1。題して、知恵ねえと楽しい沢遊びについてだが、ぶっちゃけ正解だからな。アドバイスはね、よりマシな結末を探すなら、久石春明が言ってた通り、積極的に宴に加わる方法を探すことが大事だ。今回手に入ったキー4を握りしめ、適切な場所に向かうんだ。シナリオチャートを見ればわかるが、これで開く鍵は随分前にある。言っちまうと、1、起点の振り出しだ。あそこに最初に並んでた鍵付き選択肢がようやくこれで開く。新ルート、潜入が探索可能になるぜ。より混迷を極める事件に肉薄し、今回の後悔をもう味わわないよう、全力を尽くしてやってくれよ、大将。つうわけで、今回はここまで。次も元気に死んでこい。そういう夢だ。
All right, why don't we stop it there? This is Audapostrophe. You've been watching Raging Loop, running on PlayStation 5. Again, excellent visual novel. Please pick it up. It's well worth your time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching. I will see you at the next stream.